Okay, so today we're going to be talking about some simple ways you can work the wire for your wire shoe project. So here are the basic materials that I'm starting out with. You'll notice I have two different kinds of wire here. This one here is a steel annealed wire. It's a 16 gauge wire, so it's a little bit thicker, and it's steel, so it's slightly harder to work with. But it's really great for getting the overall form of your shoe and to give you those really nice solid black lines. And they usually come in a really large 3.5 pound roll like this, and you can get smaller rolls as well. So if you decide you really like working with the wire, this is a really great resource to have. Or if you're wanting to split that up with somebody, then you can do that too and split the costs in half. So that's a really nice option. And this other wire here is an aluminum wire, and it's 18 gauge, so it's a smaller diameter aluminum wire. So it's a little easier to work with. It's a lot more pliable because the aluminum is a lot more pliable than the steel. And it's a slightly thinner gauge, so it's going to be a little bit easier on your hands. So probably if you're first starting out and you've never used the wire before, this might be a nice option for you because it's a little bit easier to work with and it's a little bit easier to manipulate. And it's a little bit, it's also it's really easy. It's a lot easier on your hands than, say, this one is. This one's really great for the overall structure of the shoe. So perhaps you can make a small model out of this stuff first and then move on to this one. Or you could just use one or the other, or you can use a combination of both. So the options are really kind of limitless here. There's also other kinds of wires like copper and silver and brass wires and things like that. Those can be a little bit difficult to work with because they are so flimsy and really soft metals. So for the purposes of this project, I would try to avoid those whenever you can. So I would more than likely just stick to the aluminum or steel for this project. Okay, and then we also have a pair of needle nose pliers. So they're called needle nose pliers because they have sort of this needle nose shape to them, right? So they're kind of just named after the shape. And what's nice about these two is that most needle nose pliers come with these, but they have a pair of snips on the inside here. So that will be great for cutting your wire down and making various shapes and making your wire shoe look as neat and pretty as possible, right? What's great about the needle nose is that they work pretty much like regular pliers, but with the needle nose you can get like really tight solid joints around pieces of your wire. So it's really nice function to have, and it almost acts like a pair of fingers, which sometimes the pliers can sort of be cumbersome because they have such that sort of stunted nose to them. So the needle nose are really great for getting into tight areas and to basically act as another pair of hands and another set of fingers, right? So needle nose are great. You can do this with other pliers. This isn't to say you have to use needle nose pliers, but I would strongly recommend getting needle nose for this project. Okay, so I'm going to work with the aluminum because that's the one I'm recommending for you guys. So they usually come in a roll like this, and some of them even have a little pair of wire cutters on here. So this came from like Lowe's or some other hardware store, I don't quite remember. Sometimes they work, sometimes not, but again, you have a pair of snips on your needle nose, so I'll just go ahead and cut that off. All right. And just so you guys saw, I just stuck it in there and cut. Kind of wiggle around, and that's about it. So I'll set that aside for just a second. So what I'm going to do first is make just a simple little U joint, so a joint that looks roughly like this, so kind of just like two bobby pins connected together. So to do that, I'll cut two pieces. And when you're cutting your pieces for when you're making your actual shoe, you always want to make sure you cut a little bit oversized because if your pieces are too short, you can't really put it back together. So if you cut your pieces of wire to oversize, then you can always cut it down, right? So in theory, you should have your orthographic drawings already ready to go, and you can use your orthographic drawing as a reference for how much wire you need to cut. But what you can also do is you could just cut off a large line of it and just start working from there too. So now I'm just kind of bending it around here. So I got a nice little tight joint on this one. Again, the aluminum's nice and flexible and it's really pliable, so I don't necessarily need to use the needle nose for getting a nice tight joint, but just to show you guys, I can pierce it just like this. And here, I'll take this off first. So if I need to get that a really tight joint, I could take the blunt end, I hope you can see that, and just kind of pinch it. So yeah, so then I can get a nice tight little line in there. It's almost like the eye of a needle, kind of. And then I can hook my other piece in there if it fits, which hopefully it will. Oops. And yeah, so that's a really tight joint right there. So I'm pretty happy with that. And I can tighten this one down. All right, got a little frayed here. So here, the bad part about the aluminum is that if you're a little bit too aggressive with it, like I just was, it could break on you. So that's another sort of a con against using the aluminum wire as opposed to the steel wire here. So you do have to be a little bit more careful with this thinner gauge aluminum stuff. You could use a thicker gauge aluminum, like a 16 gauge, and it shouldn't be as soft as this piece. So I kind of went a little overboard here. So hopefully you guys can see that, but anyway, so that's sort of like a U-ish joint. Another thing you can do is you can make shapes like this. So if you're working on those, the holes for the laces, this is actually a really nice technique in order to do that. And how I did that was I took a pen or any kind of cylindrical object. Then I will cut some of this wire off. All right. And essentially you just wrap it around. So you can get nice, tight little circles. And again, the aluminum's really nice to bend. So if you're doing shapes like this, it's really nice to bend them all together like that, right? So then once I have one, I can give myself a little space and move on to the next one. So it's a really nice option for making those little lace holes, right? And it doesn't have to be perfect, right? It could just be make an impression of that, but that seems pretty legit. So I'm happy with that. So I'll go ahead and cut that down. And that's that. Cool. So one last thing you can do, and there's lots of joints out there in terms of the wire forming, so this is just a real basic overview of what you can do. But you can make these little, what are called jump rings here. So you can pinch those together. All right. And structurally, this is not the most structural of joints, but it is a joint nevertheless. So how I did that was pretty much that same technique of wrapping it around any kind of cylindrical object. Like I said, I have a dry erase marker here, but you can use a can, you can use a pencil, you can use any kind of uniformly cylindrical object. So nothing, I mean, this is sort of conical in shape, so what I mean by that is that it tapers on this end and kind of grows outward towards that middle. But any cylindrical shape will work fine for this too, right? So I wrapped it around just like that. So now what I'll do is I'll take my snips and just cut them in one spot, cut all of them in one spot. So I should get hopefully 3 jump rings here. All right, pry them off. It looks like I'll only get 2, but that's okay. So you lose 1. Actually, I might get 3, who knows? Yeah, so then you just pick them apart. And I'll get 2, but that's okay. So there's 1. And there's 2. So you got perfect little rings every single time. And they're uniform in size, uniform in shape. So I have a little bit of give here, so I'll just push that back. And that's a jump ring. So if you take any kind of jewelry classes at this point, you might want to solder that joint so it stays together. But usually that stays pretty much intact. And for the purposes of this project, again, it's not the most stable, but just a nice option to have if you're making multiple pieces, all the same size and shape. That's how you would do it here. A couple other things about the metal that we need to address is what's called work hardening. You'll get this more often with the steel than you would the aluminum, but what happens is the more you work with it, the harder it becomes because you're basically compressing all those molecules that make up the steel together. So when you're compressing them together, they won't retain any of that memory, so it won't go back to any of its original shape. So, for example, I'll cut a piece off here. And this is already much harder to cut, again, because it's steel and it's a little bit thicker. So if I bend this at the center point here, right? It started more or less as a straight piece. So then when I try to bend it back, it's not gonna wanna bend back in that spot anymore. It's just gonna wanna retain that shape because it's work hardened in that shape. So just be mindful of that when you're working with the wire. So if you manipulate it too much, what'll happen is it'll just really start to harden and it'll get really brittle, and most likely it'll just break. So just, again, be mindful of that when you're working. You could, in some instances, straighten it back up by pretty much forcing it. I don't know if I'll be able to here, but we'll see. That worked a little bit. All right, so I can kind of have that wire as parallel in the jaws of those needle nose pliers as I can, just kind of straighten it back out. It's got a little bit of a hump there, but yeah. So that's more or less working with the wire. And those were just a couple of really simple joints. And as you work with it, you're going to be able to really understand it more and figure out what joints are going to work for you. And you can really experiment with this too. So if you make a small model of your shoe first, you can experiment with different kinds of joints to make, or even just cut little pieces out and make little joints that way. And you can really get like really tight joints too. So I'll do it with the aluminum again. I probably should have I'll choose a bigger piece here. So with the aluminum, I can really just kind of form this by hand and wrap it around and get a really tight joint. But it's sort of similar to that U-joint like I discussed earlier. So I can sort of wrap it around like that too and have pieces come off that way. So yeah, that's pretty much working with wire. So again, real basic overview, but hopefully that'll help you get started. So have at it.